It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
From earlier this week, Hurricane Helene expected to undergo rare, rapid intensification just before making landfall. That's from MSN. And so it did. Yet another case of so-called rapid intensification just prior to landfall. So why does the MSN report pretend that this now increasingly the norm scenario is, quote, rare? Question, are hurricanes much easier to manipulate once they are in close proximity to the land-based network of frequency transmitters? Is that why they don't strengthen until the last moment, aren't allowed to, perhaps? You decide. But before doing so, please take the time to search the heading of geoengineeringwatch.org, Hurricanes. There's a number of short, hard-hitting video reports, and you won't like what you learn. Next from CNN, hurricanes have changed, they say. The way we prepare for them should too. The CNN report continues with this: hurricanes aren't what they used to be. And they then say, as the planet warms, hurricanes are morphing into something more dangerous, intensifying faster, producing more rainfall, and generating bigger storm surge. Let's stop there. What ever larger elephant in the sky is missing from this report and every other lamestream media half-truth reporting? Climate engineering, aka geoengineering, aka solar radiation management, aka stratospheric aerosol injection. The list of science terms for what we see in skies above goes on and on. We are decades past the emperor has no clothes moment, and yes, we should expect power structure paid media and countless so-called experts to continue pushing their denial of the shockingly obvious and inarguable climate engineering atrocities taking place in our skies, but the terminal, eyes wide shut denial of far too many in the population is even more troubling. New from the New York Times, Helene's intensification could be aggressive. Here's why. End of headline. Question, does anyone actually believe the New York Times is going to tell us the whole truth about the numerous factors that are manipulating Hurricane Helene and every other weather climate cataclysm around the world? I'm not saying the only factor, but a core factor that cannot be left out of this equation from any perspective. There's no legitimate discussion of climate, anything from any point of view, without addressing this elephant in the equation that we're not allowed to talk about or acknowledge, at least not mainstream media and all the so-called reporters that represent them. Are they not criminal accomplices in the cover-up of these crimes taking place in our skies? So about any notion that the New York Times or any other matrix media-owned source would tell us the truth, don't hold your breath. Or on second thought, maybe you should. Maybe we all should, lest we inhale copious quantities of nanoparticle fallout from what's being dispersed into our skies. This week in Northern California, I believe Wednesday of this week, you had to see it to believe it, from Redding, California, as some moisture was allowed to flow over the baked North State. It looked like a tidal wave of toxic filth progressing in from the west, completely unnatural, alarmingly so. Did anyone notice? Does anyone take notice at all? And the incredibly intense UV that took place before this toxic wave blew over us was incredibly brutal. Trees being scorched, the bark being scorched off of trees, no insects to be seen, very few birds, fewer all the time. Nobody notices anything. Do people's heads have to be on fire before they take notice, or would they still deny that? Maybe we'll find out soon enough in the direction we're headed. Let's add this from grist.org. The perfect conditions that could make Hurricane Helene, quote, unsurvivable. That's their words in big quotes. Really? Is that what happened? How much of this exact kind of language did we see from major matrix media sources? How much have we seen in the past in the same vein? We were told there would be 20 feet of storm surge in places. Did that actually happen? What core factor of storm influence and steering, again, is no matrix media source allowed to even mention? How many covert agendas and objectives might there be that are inseparable from what occurs with the weather and the climate? Who benefits, no matter what happens? In countless other ongoing weather and climate catastrophes around the world, tens of thousands are perishing. Do we hear about any of it on mainstream matrix media? Short answer, no. With few exceptions, just a constant stream of scripted political theater. How many have ever heard about Hurricane Otis from last October that laid waste to Acapulco? And if you haven't seen the post-storm drone footage of what happened to Acapulco, please take the time. You won't believe what you see. Acapulco will never recover. It looks like some sort of a post-apocalyptic movie scene. Hurricane Otis, that went from an insignificant tropical storm to the strongest Category 5 to ever hit that part of the world. An unprecedented intensification in less than 24 hours. And what did the experts say? They had no clue how this could possibly happen. And on how many other aspects of this dire equation that we face do the experts seem to have no clue? This direct hit on Acapulco, it'll never be the same. Question, was this some sort of covert weather warfare diplomacy, something to keep Mexico in line with the powers that shouldn't be? You decide. Moving on. Next headline, geoengineering wins reluctant interest of scientists as Earth's climate unravels. That's from Scientific American. And let's add this breaking report from the New York Times. Conspiracy theorists have a new target, geoengineering. This report from this week by Christopher Flavel. First, the conspiracy theorist term is only put to use by the most fearful and factless among us. And so-called reporters like Mr. Christopher Flavel from the New York Times is revealing his moral bankruptcy in this New York Times report. Even though this Times reporter made mention of the title of my hour-long dialogue with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on the climate engineering issue, never in the entire desperate disinformation report from the New York Times was geoengineeringwatch.org mentioned. Never. Was our virally viewed groundbreaking documentary, The Dimming, mentioned, now with over 25 million views and counting? No. Why not? Because the last thing this New York Times disinformation reporter wants is to encourage his readers to actually investigate credible data from a credible source. Just slap the conspiracy theory label on the biggest and most visible conspiracy fact of all time, climate engineering, aka weather warfare, and hope your readers don't find out you have deceived them for a paycheck and a pension. Mr. Christopher Flavel. What if Mr. Flavel was inundated with emails containing links to the Dimming documentary and asked for an explanation? I wonder, do reporters like Flavel consider that once the public is forced to fully awaken to the ongoing and accelerating climate engineering catastrophes, will the masses then finally hold individuals like Flavel legally and morally accountable for the part they have played in the criminal cover-up of climate intervention operations? We'll soon enough find out, as climate intervention operations are finally forced out into the open and unfolding global ecological collapse with them. This is Dane Wigington. You're listening to the weekly installment of the commercial-free, non-political Global Alert News Report, The End of the World as We Know It, broadcast brought to you by geoengineeringwatch.org, the largest and most visited website in the world and the subject of global climate engineering operations, otherwise known as weather warfare, reaching a critical mass of awareness. This is the only way forward in this fight. You can find out why. Go to the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org. Search, how do we stop climate engineering? There is only one way forward. Much more details in that report. We can and we absolutely must reach a critical mass of awareness by starting a conversation on climate engineering. It leads people to a credible source of data. Geoengineering Watch will continue all of our efforts to be the go-to source on covert climate engineering operations. A conversation on climate engineering can easily be started with Geoengineering Watch awareness-raising materials available on our homepage. Our extremely high-quality printed materials are passed on from our site for less than our cost of producing and shipping. Our only goal, my only goal, is to bring this issue to light while there's still something left of the planet's life support system to salvage. Please, help us to sound the alarm. Moving on to unfolding and accelerating biosphere collapse, which unfortunately far too many, even from alternative media sources and sites, feel just as compelled to falsely deny as New York Times reporter Christopher Flavel denies climate engineering operations. This needs to change. We need to build bridges. We need to stand on the inarguable premise that there is no legitimate discussion of climate, anything from any perspective, without first and foremost addressing climate engineering. If we can expose it and stop it, we can fight about the rest. World's oceans near critical acidification level. This is a new report from phys.org. It's an ocean scenario. And that report doesn't sound good, does it? Because it isn't good. It's very, very bad, and it's getting worse by the day. More from the report. The world's oceans are close to becoming too acidic to properly sustain marine life, which for the record means all life, or the report states, help stabilize the climate. A new report said this on Monday, then continued by stating the sustainable level of ocean acidification is set to be exceeded, largely as a result of ever-increasing emissions of carbon dioxide, CO2. Again, what major factor is being omitted? I'll get to that. Ocean fertilization. The report then says breaching the ocean acidification boundary appears inevitable within the coming years. For the record, too late, already breached. The report then says acidic water damages corals, shellfish, and the phytoplankton that feeds a host of marine species. Yes, acidic seawater does have this impact, but again, what aren't we being told? That the disintegrating ozone layer, which climate intervention operations are the core causal factor for, is now allowing extreme UV radiation, including UVC, to bombard Earth's surface, including the oceans, including the plankton, including the corals. And for those that don't know, plankton is the single largest source of oxygen production on the planet. And recent peer-reviewed studies from the Atlantic Ocean shows a 90% decline in plankton. How long do we think we're going to be here when they no longer exist? This extreme UV radiation is frying them as they try to feed in the upper layers of the water column because plankton photosynthesize. They have to feed there, and they're being cooked. No, the ozone layer isn't getting better. It's getting worse, far worse, fast. And those that pay attention to their own sense of feel and not to some power structure talking head paid liar have long known UV radiation is getting far worse. The PHYS report then states, this means an acidified ocean also disrupts food supplies for billions of people. I alluded to that a moment ago, as well as limiting the ocean's capacity to absorb more CO2 and thus help limit global warming. Keep that point in mind. Now listen to this, the ozone layer deception part I just mentioned. PHYS says, quote, the only one of the 9 planetary boundaries that is not close to being crossed concerns the state of the planet's protective ozone layer. They continue, man-made chemicals have damaged this shield, causing acid rain, but it has, they say, recovered since a number of these chemicals were banned in 1987. This is a blatant, glaring lie. It is truly disturbing to witness how many there are among the so-called experts that are willing to tell this lie. Absolute criminal deception. Earth's rapidly deteriorating ozone layer is, in and of itself, an extremely near-term existential threat. So how do you keep populations from panicking for the moment? Just tell them it isn't so. And shockingly, that's all it takes for far too many, who then ignore their God-given sense of feel. They ignore the increasingly scorched tree foliage, the burnt-to-the-core wood tree trunks on many species, and those inferno car interiors if parked in the sun with the windows up. Please search and view the ozone destruction section on the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org if you want the truth. There's exchanges there with a former NASA contract engineer who meters UV radiation, metered before he passed on very recently, with state-of-the-art equipment, and his reports are far beyond dire. A 9th threshold, the PHYS report states, concerning concentrations of minute particles in the atmosphere that can cause heart and lung diseases is close to the danger limit. No, it's not close. It's far past the limit. Article after article now states that we're all absorbing these nanoparticles, including microplastics, in every single organ in our body, including our brains, not just polymer nanoplastics. Aluminum, barium, strontium, manganese, that's showing up in everyone that Geoengineering Watch has formally tested for hair, blood, and urine. There's nowhere to hide from this. Why is that so hard to grasp that when you look up and you see these dispersions spreading, expanding and covering entire skylines with filthy, dirty-looking aerosol clouds that look nothing like the real thing, nothing. All of that settles down to the surface where we get to inhale it with every single breath we take. So, about the PHYS article, yes, there it is, their last statement of the 9th threshold, atmospheric nanoparticles, the kind that, again, climate engineering patents call for, to be sprayed from geoengineering jet aircraft, the kind that, again, linger, spread, and often eventually cover the entire horizon with a filthy, dirty, dingy haze that looks absolutely, again, nothing like natural cloud cover. But we're officially told it isn't so. Nothing to see here. Just a conspiracy theory. Move along. Just another day in the planetary asylum. Let's keep going and remember. And yes, I'm exhausted. After 15 years of nonstop slogging in this battle, I am completely and totally exhausted. But I will never yield. Never. And every time I trek through the woods and I see a gray squirrel trying to survive, or around the ponds that I built myself in the habitat preserve, about 16 of them, with immense effort, and they still hold water, and I see the life that still exists there and the animals that are dependent on it to drink there, I know I can't give up. As long as they're continuing to try to play their part in this grand drama called life, we must do our best to play ours. And when we look our children in the eyes, we should consider and remember the moment we have children especially, we no longer own our lives. We owe them to our children. Let's press on and remember, as I've stated countless times on this broadcast and on hundreds of other interviews over the last decade and a half, if the oceans die, we die. With that in mind, from sciencealert.com, ongoing scenario. Here's the headline: World's oceans on verge of being too acidic to sustain life. Scientists warn. Do you hear that on any of the Matrix media stations that are just babbling on about whatever political puppet said what that day? Meaningless, absolutely meaningless babble while the world is imploding around us. So about that headline, that sounds really serious, doesn't it? Because it is. And it's now. It's not somewhere off in the future, it's now. Question: could decades of climate engineering sprayed dispersions over Earth's oceans be core to this equation, the acidification of the oceans? Dispersions that include what are known as ocean fertilization elements, aka a form of geoengineering to force algae blooms, which in turn forces the oceans to absorb unnatural amounts of CO2. Which of course causes ocean acidification to accelerate wildly. What a surprise. And with all that in mind, let's add this from the Boston Globe. Altering the ocean to save the climate, a game changer or a treacherous path? That's the end of the headline from the Boston Globe. Well, once we move past the Boston Globe's pretending that geoengineering, including ocean iron fertilization, is just a proposal, then the answer to the Globe's treacherous path question is, of course, yes, except that it's much worse than just a treacherous path. It's a giant nail in our collective coffins. And for the record, there are already well over 500 ocean dead zones around the world, and more by the day, and they're expanding and merging, and on the current course will sooner than almost any dare to believe encompass all of Earth's ocean, singular. There's only one. It's all connected. So, in summary of all that I just covered, some of the so-called climate scientists are finally acknowledging Earth's oceans are radically acidifying and dying. And at the same time, other so-called climate scientists stating that we could, may, might need to deploy ocean fertilization climate engineering operations, as if it hasn't been going on for over 75 years already, in order to force Earth's oceans to uptake even more CO2, which this group of so-called experts seems to believe is a good thing. A necessary thing in order to keep the carbon fuel carnival going just a bit longer before total collapse, which for the record, the longer the coming inevitable collapse is delayed, the more furious and final it will be. Keep that in mind. Moving on, this next report is extremely important. What it indicates is that at least some in the halls of academia and government are beginning to summon their courage. Finally, they're starting to face the fact that the entire ship is going down and they're all passengers on it. This is the now or never moment to tell the truth. From the Center for International Environmental Law, political momentum for solar geoengineering non-use growing. They say, as the 79th UN General Assembly and New York Climate Week draw to a close, that's this week, momentum to reject solar geoengineering is growing. Countries across Africa, Latin America, and the Pacific and Europe have signaled their support for the Solar Geoengineering Non-Use Agreement initiative, which is already backed by over 500 multidisciplinary academics and almost 2,000 civil society organizations. So what's the next step to further this desperately needed momentum? Each and every individual, organization, and country needs to acknowledge the totality of the truth that global climate engineering operations have been fully deployed since the end of World War II and perpetually expanded ever since. Criminal collusion and cooperation between nations behind the scenes, behind closed doors, at events like the so-called COP climate conferences. That's what takes place there. They're not planning on changing business as usual. They're forcing countries to either actively or passively participate in the climate engineering insanity. Those behind the Solar Geoengineering Non-Use Agreement need to acknowledge that grave and irreparable damage has long since been inflicted on the planet, human health, and the entire web of life. Those behind the Solar Geoengineering Non-Use Agreement need to make clear the fact that if we collectively continue on the current course, our days are numbered. Each of us, all of us, extremely near-term planetary omnicide is kicking in the front door now in real time. And what is the response of the matrix controllers in the military-industrial complex in regard to climate intervention operations? To double down on this atrocity in our skies. Of course, why in the world would we expect otherwise? Weather warfare is the crown jewel covert weapon of control for the predator-parasite class that prints money out of thin air, that fuels and foments conflict and carnage wherever and whenever it suits their agendas and objectives. It always has been so. Carefully crafted propaganda is then force-fed to populations that far too often gulp it down without a second thought. Such is the state of the world. So about the behind closed doors criminal collusion and cooperation between nations that has been ongoing for decades, it's breaking down. And as I have desperately tried to warn about for almost 2 decades, once biosphere collapse accelerates to the crossroad, to the point where there's no longer enough to go around, which for the record is now, where there's literally no longer enough to eat or drink in dozens of nations right now and more every day, and everything we do eat or drink is contaminated along with every breath we take, then much like criminal cartels that cooperate to a point, infighting is spawned as certain collapse unfolds and accelerates. With all that in mind, this breaking headline: leaders at climate meetings in New York, that's this week, warn of growing mistrust between nations. This new harbinger headline of the impending acceleration of global conflict is from Reuters. More on this in a moment. But consider that when the point of public panic finally hits, how many will look in the mirror and ask themselves how or why they didn't see it coming? Because they didn't want to. Eyes and ears wide shut. This must change, or we have no chance. From newscientist.com, jet stream shifts are linked to fires, failed harvests, and the plague. What this report is trying to accomplish is to falsely imply that the biosphere collapse harbingers that are unfolding across the globe at present have taken place over other centuries in the past, but that's a lie. There's nothing whatsoever natural about the current Earth changes and the speed at which they are unfolding, which is unknown in Earth's geologic past. It's happening hundreds of times faster than any previous mass extinction event, and none of this bodes well for the fate of the human race or life on Earth. The faster these changes occur, the worse the changes are overall. The longer the equilibrium period will be whenever this event, this epoch, is done. And to put this into perspective, based on past previous extinctions that are the most comparable to this, although this is much worse for many reasons. We no longer have a functional ozone layer. The speed at which these changes are happening, again, hundreds of times faster than any previous event. But even with all that in mind, the most comparable event is the Pedum event, Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum, 55 million years ago. How long did it take the Earth to recover after that? The equilibrium period, about 10 to 20 million years. That's a long time, and this event is worse. The New Scientist report states, extreme weather caused by shifts in a jet stream seems to have brought summers of fires, failed harvests, and rampant disease across Europe over the past 700 years. That's the conclusion of an analysis of tree ring data, which also provides worrying clues for what the future holds under a changing climate. Let's stop there. Yes, never mind that the last 2 centuries of industrialized, militarized, so-called society ransacking the planet. Never mind 75 years of completely insane attempts by the human race to control the planet's primary life support systems via a covert global climate engineering Manhattan Project, which again includes the dumping of 40 to 60 million tons of highly toxic nanoparticles into our skies annually. Never mind the detonation of over 2,400 nuclear weapons, many of them in the atmosphere, with still unknown consequences to this day. Never mind the endless rocket launches that rip gaping tears in what's yet left of Earth's life-giving ozone layer. Never mind the nuclear power plant meltdowns, with 442 more to go. And about the plagues mentioned by the New Scientist report, which they seem to imply is just a normal part of Earth's geologic past and processes, never mind the hundreds of known instances of biological warfare and testing by unchecked military madness around the globe, never mind the hundreds of level 4 biolabs all over the world. New Scientist wants us to think it's all just part of the natural processes. Go back to sleep, nothing to see here. Or so they would like us all to believe. For the record, there is absolutely nothing natural about man's war against nature, which is ultimately a war against ourselves on countless fronts, with climate engineering at the top of the list. On that note, this new headline of considerable interest from militaryaerospace.com. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration eyes replacing network of WSR-88D NEXRAD weather radar to warn of tornadoes and thunderstorms. Let's stop there. Question: are the NEXRAD frequency transmission installations doing so much more than just monitoring the weather? And are they, in fact, manipulating it? All available data clearly indicates the answer is yes. So might we ask and consider, what are the core motivations behind the upgrading of the NEXRAD frequency transmitters? Do we have even more grave levels of weather manipulation and weather warfare in store for us all? We'll find out soon enough. The NEXRAD network was developed in the early 1990s, for the record. And on the subject of doomsday events, the fate of the polar regions is far more grave and immediate than almost any yet realize or are willing to admit. From CNN, scientists look deep beneath the doomsday glacier. This is an ongoing story. What they found spells potential disaster for the planet. The report says their findings set out across a collection of studies which provide the clearest picture yet of this complex, ever-changing glacier. The outlook is grim, they say. The scientists said in a report published Thursday of this week, and the key conclusions of their 6 years of research. Is CNN telling us the truth? No. It's even worse than this. And what they do report, when it is true, is only because they can't hide it any longer. And about the melting of the polar regions, please, it's not about who to believe. I hear from so many people that appear to have not done any research themselves. They just say, well, this person said this and that person said that, and I don't know what to believe. Please do your own research. Believe yourself. Believe what you can see when you start with. The internationally award-winning film Chasing Ice, and it's far worse than when this film was done, but the footage in that film is beyond shocking. Non-political, only frontline footage, indisputable footage. Please research for yourself. The meltdown is real. Climate engineering, the attempt to use weather as a weapon and mask the meltdown by chemical ice nucleation. That's why we have the massive hail everywhere constantly now. It's just the norm, with extreme surface level winds, because they're using those winds created by the manipulation of atmospheric pressure zones to enhance the endothermic reaction of these ice nucleating elements, to make them more effective. for a temporary toxic cool down. That's why we have these extreme weather whiplash events, just like we've had in Northern California. We had one in August, we had one in September where we're 100 degrees up to this event. Little moisture moves through, they chemically nucleate it, temperatures drop by 50 degrees and are right back up a day or two later, right back up to the hundreds. Happened in August, happened again this month. There's nothing normal or natural about that, and it's happening everywhere to a degree. Weather and temperature whiplash, not nature. Climate intervention operations. Pressing on, how many remember the recent reports, sensationalized reports about the unexplainable rapid cooling of parts of the Atlantic? And as I explained on this broadcast, the Matrix paid so-called experts came up with that headline after a hurricane passed through part of the Atlantic, a very powerful hurricane that churned up some of the deeper water and cooled off the surface temperatures very temporarily. So what do we have now? North Atlantic sea surface temperatures are once again at record highs. What a surprise. What about the Arctic sea ice volume? That's at record low, but not the extent. Volume is the mass, the extent is the surface area. How can the volume be at record lows and not the extent? Because now official so-called agencies are considering sea ice, any area of Arctic Ocean that's 15% slush or more. Isn't that still 85% ocean? But this is how they falsify statistics and how you can have record low ice volume, but not, at least officially, record low extent, masking what's happening in the Arctic. And what's happening in the Arctic has much to do with the baking of the U.S. West, the constant high-pressure heat dome that's parked over us that compresses air so much so that not only does it fry during the daytime, but when the sun goes down, there's almost no air movement under the high-pressure heat domes. Very still, stagnant air, and the temperatures don't drop at night because of that compressing air from an ionosphere heater-induced high-pressure heat dome, which manipulates the upper-level wind currents clockwise around that massive heat dome and pushes that moisture north where they're trying to chemically nucleate it and mask what's occurring in the Arctic at the cost of making it worse overall. And where is the moisture going to end up? In fact, already ending up from the spinoff from Hurricane Helene. It's going up the eastern seaboard, no accident, to cool the most populated portions of the U.S. down, and then it's pressing on toward parts of the Arctic. No surprise, moisture pump to help cool things down temporarily and toxically. How's that working after 75 years and we are unbelievably close to planetary omnicide, with so few yet aware? It's going to change soon. Can't hide what's coming for much longer. And yes, I do sound jaded because I am. 20 plus years in this battle can do that to you when you see so many, especially when you see so many sitting the sidelines and allowing the few to try to move this fight up the field. Again, that has to change, or we have no chance. This battle will take all of us. All of us are spokes in this wheel, all of us necessary to make it roll. We are here for a reason. We need to always remember that. Next, a new headline from a not-so-new proposal of total idiocy. From newscientist.com, geoengineering is now essential to saving the Arctic's ice. If we want to preserve the dwindling ice in the Arctic, cutting our emissions is no longer enough. We also need to use geoengineering to refreeze this precious ecosystem. So let's combine that with this other New Scientist report. Plan to refreeze Arctic sea ice shows promise, they say, in first tests. Covered part of this on a previous broadcast, but this is a follow-up new headline. Field trials indicate that pumping seawater onto the snow on top of the Arctic sea ice can make the ice thicker, offering a possible way to preserve sea ice throughout the summer. A bold plan to pump seawater over the frozen Arctic Ocean could offer humanity a final chance to save the region's vanishing sea ice. This is so far beyond moronic, I don't have the words. So you're going to bring some sort of carbon fuel-powered pump to pump water from below the ice to the surface, which allows warm water to penetrate deeper into the ocean. And if it goes deep enough to warm the seabed, where it will thaw and release methane, hydrate, and clathrate deposits, which will then migrate to the surface into the atmosphere, further cover the planet like a layer of glass, which fuels a feedback loop of yet more warming, more methane release. This is so incredibly, ridiculously moronic from the so-called science community. And if you watch the films of this testing, it's beyond idiotic, absolutely beyond idiotic. Some researchers out on a strand of ice with a generator running a pump, pumping some water onto the surface, and they managed to create a little bit of ice. And we're going to save the ice packs like that, just like we're going to save them by covering them with tarps or all the other beyond comprehension forms of idiotic proposals coming from the global climate science community. I don't have the words anymore. I mean, we live in a complete asylum. I'm numb. But what about this new report from thewatchers.org? Unusually heavy snowfall leaves hundreds stranded on roads in South Africa in places where you wouldn't normally see it. Chemical ice nucleation. Again, these sensationalized headlines, we see that snow in the pyramids for the first time in 2,000 years, and people see that, and it doesn't matter if it's been record heat for months and months. They see that headline and they think, oh, okay, that must be the real story. It must really be getting colder, even though it's getting exponentially hotter. And that's the psychological aspect of climate engineering and chemical ice nucleation. We need to acknowledge all aspects of climate engineering. Why is geoengineeringwatch.org the only source that is trying to bring chemical ice nucleation, cloud seeding to light? Why? Because it doesn't fit the ideology of other sources and sites? Doesn't fit the false narrative that the planet's cooling when it's in total meltdown, with climate engineering making it worse, not better? We need to stand on solid, credible ground and do actual research ourselves and not say, well, I heard this here and I heard that there, and I don't know what to think. Because that doesn't bring us to credible conclusions about conditions closer to home. And in the case of this next headline, especially close to home for me. From the LA Times, quote, "It's really sad. River dries up abruptly in Bakersfield, leaving thousands of dead fish." Bakersfield, California. This is the lower end of the Kern River. The report states that the flowing stopped so abruptly that there were fish flopping helplessly along the banks, masses of dead fish scattered on the riverbed by the hundreds. The sudden loss of the river has come as a shock in Bakersfield with my father, who died at 49 years old. I used to fish the Upper Kern River with my dad. I have many memories from there. To think that that river has now gone dry is shocking. And there are so many more that have done exactly the same. And the drought monitor lie, the U.S. drought monitor, absolute, complete lie, showing the minimal designation of drought in Northern California when it's as dry. The fuel moisture is as low as it's ever been. It's as dry as it's ever been here as far as soil moisture. The evaporation rate is off the scale. And yet, they are putting us under the minimum designation of drought. They're falsifying temperatures across the board and data from every direction, including the ozone layer. It's up to us to assess the situation ourselves with our own investigation, not spending time watching football games or scripted political idiocy. Please investigate the foundational factors on which all of our lives completely depend. Is that not a reasonable request? Dying trees, forests are dying everywhere. The West Coast U.S., the same. The fir trees are dying so fast where I live that every day I look out across the canyons, I see more of them flashing out. How long does anybody think that can continue? Moving on from InsideClimateNews.com, new study suggests major climate reports may be underestimating drought risks. Exactly as I just stated, North America and South Africa, in particular, may endure longer dry spells than water managers expect, but research shows rising emissions magnifying both wet and dry extremes. No mention of the desiccant particles of climate engineering, which dry out the atmosphere. It depends on the type of particle they seed the clouds with, can augment precipitation or completely dry it up. The climate engineers control the spigot. They say newly calibrated models showed that the increase in the longest annual dry spell could be about twice what the older models predicted. All of the data, all the modeling is completely manipulated. Think about this, as I've stated so many times. Raytheon and Lockheed Martin do all the weather modeling for the National Weather Service and National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. We have the Foxes running the henhouse. Why would our weathermen need private defense contractors to give them the weather modeling? Because they're part of the weather manipulation and the script needs to match. That's why. From phys.org, Amazon forest loses area the size of Germany and France, fueling fires. Should that shock somebody? Should that make a headline somewhere on Matrix Media televised so-called news? Here's another right now example of the drying and the dying. New from Newsweek.com, over 75,000 birds killed in North California lake disease outbreak. They say it's the worst outbreak in the region's history. Thousands more expected to die in the coming weeks. Avian botulism is a disease caused by a toxin. Bottom line is, the waters are drying up, superheating. They're toxic from the toxic rain fallout and runoff, which kills beneficial microbiome. And what happens? Non-beneficial then erupts. I've been over that again and again and again. And what's occurring in other parts of the world? Devastating record deluge. Climate engineers control the spigot. Record deluge, record drought, unprecedented weather and temperature whiplash events, all harbingers of climate intervention operations. As mentioned at the start of this broadcast, more on the planet's now breached life support systems. This is new from the UK Guardian, ongoing report, and it's getting worse by the day. Earth may have breached 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries. Health check shows, for the record, officially, only recently we were told 6 of the 9 planetary life support boundaries had already been breached. Now it's officially 7, but in reality, it's all of them. The UK Guardian report continues. Ocean acidification, follow up on what I reported earlier, close to critical thresholds, say scientists, posing threat to marine ecosystems and global livability. It's already past the threshold. Industrial civilization is close to breaching a 7th planetary boundary and may already have crossed it. Already have, as I stated, according to scientists who have compiled the latest report on the state of the world's life support systems. They continue. Ocean acidification is approaching a critical threshold, particularly in high latitude regions. Remember the 10 or 11 billion snow crabs that disappeared? This is part of why. They say the latest report on planetary boundary states the growing acidification poses an increasing threat to marine ecosystems, which means all of us. Coral dying around the world, kelp forests dying around the world, fisheries collapsing around the globe. How long does anyone think this can continue? Let me take an off-ramp for a minute because there's a jewel here that needs to be heard. First, from the Rockefeller Foundation. Social media and news data analysis shows urgent need to better communicate the health impact of climate change. What are they leaving out? What is the most significant factor affecting every single breath we take at this moment with toxic elements? Look up. Look up. Look at the testing. View the Dimming documentary and the testing we did at altitude with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Flying Lab. Top scientists in it found what we knew we would find: climate engineering elements, starting with aluminum nanoparticles, all on film, all on the record, processed at Rensselaer Polytechnic in New York, world-renowned lab. Please look, investigate, and understand the official denial is criminal at this point and can't be hidden much longer, which makes the power structure more desperate and dangerous than they've ever been before. Let's continue with this. From DWTB in Germany, listen to this. Huge areas of forest are dying in Germany, but also in the rest of Europe and the US. But they say this could actually be good news for the forest and the planet, with about 5 exclamation points. Well, there you have it. Horrific news like mass forest die-off is actually good news. So says DWTV from Germany. Orwellian doublespeak. Up is down, day is night, bad is good. And sadly, how many will actually buy into this Orwellian deception? Wait, there's more. Unbridled stupidity from the planetary asylum. From Politico.eu, Poland's Donald Tusk, their leader, declares war on, wait for it, beavers. Beavers. Because he blames them for the flooding there, as other so-called scientists blame the Arctic beavers for the warming there. And then we have the space mirror idiocy. I'll get to part of that in a moment. Tarps for the polar regions, Brazil-sized balloons in space, the pumping seawater onto the sea ice to freeze the Arctic. It's just a non-stop parade of stupidity. And on that note, here's another major helping of mental moronicism. New from TechCrunch.com. Sequoia's first space investment since SpaceX is in sunlight. Solar Reflect Orbital. That's their name. And they then state, this is the future that Reflect Orbital imagines is possible. The startup is developing satellites that would deploy large mirrors to precisely reflect sunlight onto specific points on the ground, rings of satellites in sun-synchronized orbits, providing additional sunlight before dawn and after dusk. Let's stop there and consider the true depth of idiocracy and deception that this moronic proposal implies. Thousands of jets are circling the globe, spewing tens of millions of tons of toxic sun-blocking particles into our skies, and the so-called science Experts propose that we should somehow magically deploy massive reflectors into space to reflect even more sunlight into the atmosphere and onto the planet's surface of an already incinerating planet, where the geoengineering jets can spew even more atmospheric nanoparticles to block the additional reflected sunlight. Does any of this make any sense whatsoever? Of course it doesn't. Yes, truly, the fun never stops in the planetary asylum. You're listening to the weekly installment of Global Alert News, the Bad News Broadcast, installment number 477, September 28, 2024. This is Dane Wigington, your host. Global Alert News brought to you by geoengineeringwatch.org, the largest and most visited website in the world on the subject of climate intervention operations known as geoengineering. Recordings of this commercial-free, non-political broadcast can be found on the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org under the recent column and on the Dane Wigington YouTube channel. I'm going to cut this announcement short. I'm almost out of time. I have more headlines I want to try to get to because they're breaking so fast I can't cover them all. Please help us to sound the alarm. Help us to spread the dimming documentary, available for free at the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org. Please email that to every environmental article author, to environmental organizations, so-called elected officials. The list is long indeed. We need to get this data out to start spot fires of awareness while we can, while we still have some means of communicating. And about starting a conversation on this issue, on our homepage, we have our awareness-raising materials. Our printed materials are extremely effective. If they don't wake someone up, they're not going to wake up right now. And we pass these on for less than our cost of producing and shipping. We also have shirts, hoodies. Those help start up conversations. I wear my Geoengineering Watch shirt almost all the time when I go to Reading. Have started many conversations. I keep booklets and cards with me. Once those conversations start, pass that on. I don't have to spend all day with that person. They can investigate on their own in a more relaxed setting. If they want to communicate, I try to when I can, but I always keep materials with me, generally wear a shirt wherever I go. Scannable business cards, bumper stickers, we have all of this on our homepage, all of it effective awareness-raising material, and that is our goal. Critical mass of awareness, without which we have no chance in this battle. If we can awaken our military brothers and sisters to what they're participating in, and their families know what they're participating in, we have a chance of stopping these programs from the inside out. And when I started this battle 20 plus years ago, no one listened to any of the data that I produced. But along the way, when people realized they are on the same boat that I'm on, and that boat is sinking, and they will sink with it, then they join the battle. And that's the point we need to reach. The pitchforks and torches moment, when people realize what's being done to them without their knowledge or consent, and they realize this is indeed a real-time, right-now fight for life, period. If you have one of our shirts or hoodies and you can take a photo of yourself in some ideally crowded location, please send it to us at geoengineeringwatch.org. We'll put it on our activist compilations section where others can see it, which may inspire them to also help us to sound the alarm. My deepest gratitude to all those that are helping me forge forward in this fight. I can't do it alone. Pressing on from Reuters.com. What's happening on the ground in real time? Hottest U.S. city, Phoenix, smashes heat streak record. Again, it's ongoing. It's not an old headline. It's brand new, but the record keeps being smashed. The 113th day streak was reached, which smashes Phoenix's previous record of 76 days over 100. Completely obliterated it. Is anything wrong? How long does anybody think that those regions are going to be habitable when they're running out of water and it's so hot you certainly can't grow anything? You have to stay inside and crank the air conditioner up as long as the power grid's on, and when that shuts down, the carnage will really unfold. They say there was also 40 days of 110 degrees or higher compared with 5 days at the beginning of the last century. From 5 days over 110 to 40. I wonder if something's wrong. Next headline from Bloomberg, climate change is so bad, even the Arctic is on fire. They say from Siberia to Brazil, wildfires are moving underground and burning up massive carbon deposits, not just on the surface, is it? The resulting emissions threaten to worsen global warming. It's not threatened to worsen, it obviously does. That's like saying if you leap off the 100-story building, it could worsen your health. Really? What sets these fires apart, Bloomberg says, is their tendency to move below ground into carbon-rich soil layers. While wildfires generally flame upwards, of course, quickly consuming forest and grassland, the increasingly intense blazes of recent years move downward, where they smolder flamelessly below the surface, consuming layers of organic material. The phenomenon isn't confined to the Arctic. The record-shattering fires that ravaged Canada last year, blanketing New York City and other parts of the U.S., choking smoke, began as forest fires in the subarctic and lower regions that in some cases moved underground where they smoldered beneath the snow and ice all winter long. This is also releasing methane, seabed methane deposits thawing and releasing now, and that is a massive, massive problem. If you've never seen the craters from the methane literally exploding out of the tundra, please search Siberian methane craters. You will absolutely be shocked. You can see these images in the dimming as well. About the methane craters and the methane that's now migrating into the atmosphere and trapping heat in the planet, along with climate engineering particles trapping heat. New from msn.co, methane levels at 800,000 year high, accelerating sixth mass extinction, happening now. Forgive me for doubling back to the latest UN meeting on the increasingly panicked power structure puppets that are ever more aware of the fact that biosphere collapse has beat them to the proverbial intersection, with climate engineering further fueling the fire. The United Nations Summit of the Future in 2024 is a high-level gathering of the world leaders at the UN headquarters in New York to address global challenges and gaps in governance. This summit took place this week, September 22nd, 23rd. The summit's goals include, from the report, strengthening global governance. The summit will work to strengthen global governance for current and future generations. Translation, tightening the noose while populations remain oblivious. And about the UN mention of future generations, short of a complete course correction, there won't be any. Next UN item, reaffirming commitments. The summit will reaffirm existing commitments such as the Sustainable Development Goals and the United Nations Charter. Massive oxymoron, complete contradiction of reality. There can't be any sustainable development on a finite planet with finite resources, a planet that is already likely mortally wounded. Third UN agenda item, creating a new consensus. The summit will work to create a new international consensus on how to deliver a better present and safeguard the future. Let's stop there. Mindless, meaningless babble on that agenda item, the let's all just think happy thoughts and we'll live happily ever after mantra. How's that working out so far? UN item number 4, finding multilateral solutions. The summit will work to find multilateral solutions for a better tomorrow. Another example of non-definitive, meaningless babble. So back to the follow-up on the headline mentioned at the start of this broadcast from Reuters. Leaders at climate meetings in New York warn of growing mistrust between nations. A 2-day climate-themed summit for the future on Sunday as part of the UN General Assembly, where some leaders warned of growing mistrust between nations as climate-fueled disasters mount. Countries are showing, quote, collective amnesia about the need to tackle these polluting fuels. The report then states, digital technologies spread climate disinformation that deepens distrust and fuels polarization. Are they referring to an organization like geoengineeringwatch.org that is trying to point out whether warfare is being waged against other countries and their populations have no idea what's going on? Yes, the state-sponsored mafia cartels that far too many still believe are legitimate governments are beginning to infight, and it will get worse fast from here on out. Wait and see. So many times on this broadcast, I've tried to sound the alarm about the fact that agencies like the EPA exist to hide dire threats from the population, not to disclose them. On that note, from ProPublica.org, EPA scientists said they were pressured to downplay harms from chemicals a watchdog found they were retaliated against, just like they are pressured or threatened to downplay the severity of damage already done to the ozone layer while ignoring climate engineering at the same time. The ProPublica article continues with this. 3 reports issued by the agency's inspector general detailed personal attacks suffered by the scientists. A small group of government scientists came forward with disturbing allegations. They said their managers at the Environmental Protection Agency began pressuring them to make new chemicals they were vetting seem safer than they really were. They were encouraged to delete evidence of chemicals' harms, including cancer, miscarriage, and neurological problems from their reports. And in some cases, they said their managers deleted the information themselves. After the scientists pushed back, they received negative performance reviews, and 3 of them were removed from their positions in the EPA's Division of New Chemicals. Yes, punish the messenger, any who dare to tell the truth, as it has always been. Consider this timeless nugget on that exact theme from Gustave Le Bon. The masses have never thirsted after truth. Whoever can supply them with illusions is easily their master. Whoever attempts to destroy their illusions is always their victim. The sand in the hourglass is rapidly running out. All who are aware and awake are desperately needed in the front line of this fight. If we can expose and halt what's occurring in our skies and allow the planet to respond on its own to the damage already done, we could buy precious time to then focus on other converging threats. Who can say what may yet be possible if we fully apply ourselves to the battle at hand, a battle for all that we hold dear? Check the activist suggestions link on the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org for specific instructions on how you can move this fight forward. Please make every day count. Time is not on our side. Until next week, this is Dane Wigington from geoengineeringwatch.org.